Pinball has been around for years. Depending on who you ask and what you consider pinball to even be, it can go back to the 1930s, the 1800s, or even before then. While these early ones will obviously look extremely primitive to us, and flippers weren't even introduced until 1947 with Humpty Dumpty, there are still many things that we look at and immediately think of as pinball. A couple of weeks ago, I did a community post here on YouTube talking about how it was the 40th anniversary of pinball on the Nintendo Famicom. Along with that post, I did a poll to see whether people actually enjoyed playing digital video game versions of pinball. And I found that people were kind of split. 42% of you said yes, 45% of you said no, with only 13% saying that they didn't like pinball at all. This post got us talking internally over at I Dream of Retro Games to talk about different video pinball games that we enjoyed playing, and that's how I came up with today's list to come up with some games that maybe you haven't played or enjoyed before if you do like playing pinball games. But before I get onto today's list, I'd like for you to shoot your skill shot over at patreon.com/idreamofindiegames. Over there, you'll be able to see different ways that you can help support us here at this channel, as well as over at the main channel at I Dream of Indie Games. It's all together as one different supporting package, and there are different tiers based on what your budget is. You'll get access to our Discord server, early access to some videos, and maybe even some free games. So again, check us out over at patreon.com/idreamofindiegames. And now, on to the list of 5 different video pinball games that you might not have played. Now, this list is in no particular order, and I really found it difficult to even try and pick some favorites, so I just figured I'd pick some that maybe weren't as well known, with one notable exception that I will save until the end. So to kick things off, I'll start with Revenge of the Gator for the Nintendo Game Boy. It was released in 1989 in Japan and in 1990 here in North America, as well as in Europe. Both developed and published by HAL Laboratory, they are famously independent but closely associated with Nintendo. They are sometimes even referred to as a second-party studio. HAL got their name because, quote, each letter put them one step ahead of IBM, and after initially developing for the VIC-20, they moved on to the Nintendo Famicom. It was on the Famicom that they made Golf, Balloon Fight, The Adventures of Lolo series, and of course Pinball, which would make them perfect to develop a Game Boy game that is based on pinball. I think though that most famously what everybody would think of with HAL Laboratory is the Kirby series. The concept of Revenge of the Gator is simple: don't get eaten by that gator. This is just simply like playing any other pinball game, and if you fall down the middle point, that's where you go onto the screen with the Gator that opens up wide and chomps you dead. There are 4 different ways to play Gator. There's Gator 1-player, Gator 2-player, and Match Play A and B. The normal Gator game is to get a high score just like any other pinball, and there is a top 5 that you're trying to make it onto. Gator is only one table, for lack of a better term, for this pinball game, but there are 4 main screens that you can play. As you hit the ball up higher, you'll move on to a new screen. Although it's not smoothly scrolling, it just will transfer over to the next one. There are also 3 bonus screens and technically another extra screen when you have the Gator, where he eats you and you lose. HAL Laboratory was smart though, and with the 2-player mode, you can still play it with just one Game Boy, as just with any other pinball game, you'll do alternating turns. The controls are just as you would expect, with the B and A buttons controlling your left and right flippers accordingly, and everything smoothly animates much more than you would expect for a regular Game Boy game. While not a ton of stuff being able to happen all at the same time, there is still plenty to try to get you to get a little bit better and work on your skills. If ever you get bored of just trying to beat your high scores or your friends after you've passed it around a little bit, there's still the Match Play, which is a multiplayer way of playing, which requires you to have 2 copies of the game, 2 Game Boys, and the link cable, which is a bit tough in today's day and age. Later on, when the game was re-released on the 3DS Virtual Console, this mode was obviously missing. The difference between A and B is A is for beginner and B is for experts, but it's a game setup where you can see your opponent on the same screen as you, and you're hitting the ball back and forth until you get by one of your opponent's flippers. Whenever you hit your opponent's targets, that will lower their score, and if you can lower their score to 0 and get one by them, then you win. I never actually played this game when it was initially available or even on an actual Game Boy, but when it came out on the 3DS Virtual Console, I immediately bought it since I'm a huge fan of pinball. I ended up spending way more time with it than I thought I would and sunk a lot of hours trying to beat high scores. Sadly, with all the various closures of the Virtual Consoles, this one isn't as easy to come by or play today, but there are still ways that you can find it not all that expensively, and last year, Revenge of the Gator Gold was released, which is a ROM hack that added color, got rid of the slowdown, let you save some scores, and even got some bug fixes in there. Next up, if playing a black and white handheld game wasn't quite up your alley, we have Epic Pinball for PC, which was initially released on DOS. This was the first game that came to mind when we started talking about video pinball games because it's one I spent a lot of time playing as a kid. Originally released in 1993 and developed by James Schmalz, before he later went on to form Digital Extremes. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because they're the makers of Warframe and they also co-created the Unreal series. This all makes sense because Epic Mega Games, yes, that Epic, were the publishers of Epic Pinball. James developed 6 tables from scratch in 9 months while still in college after Tim Sweeney of Epic showed him a demo. What helped Epic Pinball stand out was the fact that it was released as a shareware game. For those of you unaware and didn't watch our Raptor video, shareware was a way of distributing games where you got kind of a glorified demo that they encouraged you to copy and give to your friends. These games would typically only have particular levels that you could access, with further episodes available later on by purchasing the full game. In the case of Epic Pinball, you only got 1 table, and there were multiple packs that you could buy afterward to give you more. As mentioned, I played this game a ton as a kid, but it was when I repurchased the game through GOG that I realized that I only ever played the shareware table. I remember spending so many hours, but as I played through the other packs and the other tables, none of them looked familiar to me at all. To be able to keep the game on floppy disks, it was released as 3 separate packs with 4 tables each. Pack 1 had Android, which was the shareware level, Pot of Gold, Excalibur, which was based on a table from the 70s, and Crash and Burn. Also of note is that the original shareware in early retail had Android, but later versions had Super Android. Pack 2 had Magic, Jungle Pinball, which was based on Epic Games' Jill of the Jungle, which I'm sure will be covered again later on in this channel, Deep Sea, and Enigma. Pack 3 had Cybergirl, Pangea, Space Journey, and Toy Factory, and there was a CD-ROM version that you could buy that included all of those packs, plus another exclusive table called African Safari. If the Android, Crash and Burn, and Pangea tables look familiar to you and you are an iOS user, there was a remake released in 2011 that was retitled to Retro Pinball. Epic Pinball still plays great today as it's easy to pick up and play as with any pinball game. You just use the left and right arrow keys to use your flippers and the spacebar to use the plunger. The screen scrolls smoothly, and with so many tables to pick from, it's really hard to get bored because each table provides plenty of variety. I see it frequently on sale on GOG.com, so there's not really much risk when you can get it for as little as $1.79. With all the tables that it provides, you'll have plenty of fun if you're a fan of pinball. For the next game on the list, I decided to phone a friend because I wanted to be able to play a game I never heard of or played before, and they recommended to me Super Pinball Behind the Mask on the Super Nintendo. Released in January of 1994 in Japan, May of 94 in North America, and August of 94 in Europe, it was developed by Kazi, which is a developer that was founded in 1987. They were well known for developing pachinko and pinball games, including the Digital Pinball series on Sega Saturn, which, spoiler, is not going to be on the list today. Published in Japan by Meldac, obviously it was the North American version that I played, which was published by Nintendo, and even included the Only on Nintendo sticker on the front that you saw in some later games. Super Pinball only has 3 tables to pick from. You have Jolly Joker with a clown theme, Blackbeard and Iron Man, which has a pirate theme, and obviously the fantasy-themed Wizard. Instead of having the usual overhead view that was pretty common at the time, Super Pinball instead opted to do a more tilted 3D view that let you see the whole table at once. The developers were also smart and allowed for up to 4 players to play in hot seat mode, which basically means that you just take your turns and pass the same controller to play. No multi-tap needed. There is the regular mode where you just pick which table you want to play and set a high score, but there's also the Conquest mode where you play through each table in a row, and the only way to pass on to the next one is by getting 100 million points. The controls are simple and intuitive enough where you use L and R to control your flippers and the D-pad to nudge in those directions. Despite some of these development choices that I thought were pretty good made by the game makers of Super Pinball, I am quite surprised that my friend recommended this game to me. Unfortunately, with only 3 tables to pick from, you would hope that each table would have enough variety, but they were just very basic and didn't have a whole lot going on. They barely animated, and there wasn't really a whole lot to interact with, so you just get bored very quickly. So yes, it was a Super Nintendo exclusive, but I found myself having more fun playing games on other platforms, including on the Sega Genesis, like for our next game, Crue Ball. Yes, that's Crue Ball, C-R-U-E, as in Motley Crue, and sometimes is called Crue Ball Heavy Metal Pinball, released in 1992 in Europe and North America and 1993 in Japan. Developed by NewFX, they had made ports of Rygar, Hard Drive, and Zybots for the Atari Lynx before making Crue Ball, and afterwards continued to make ports of games for the Lynx as well as the Game Gear. Crue Ball was published by Electronic Arts, and NewFX continued their relationship with EA, making other sports games for them, and even went on to make the NBA Street Series. Unfortunately, they were bought by EA in 2004 and merged into EA Chicago. The concept is pretty simple. You just make a pinball game that's themed for the band Motley Crue. It features 3 of their songs, Dr. Feelgood, Livewire, and Home Sweet Home, which are each from a different album. The original prototype was called Twisted Flipper, and they actually wanted to give it the name Headbangers Ball, but MTV was not interested. Very late into development, Motley Crue was added, and that would explain why there's so much original non-Crue music, and those songs that are from the band are only heard in the menus. Most of the game's music is composed by a former Data East pinball machine composer, Brian Schmidt. Once again, we have a game that does support up to 4 players doing the hot seat method, and there is a main table that is 3 screens high. Knock out targets in the lower 2 screens and get access to the top screen. Once on the top screen, if you get up the ramp, you'll move on to the next level. There are 9 levels total, but they all mostly look the same and just have different objectives. There is quite a bit going on in the levels where it doesn't play like a traditional pinball game, as you have creatures that are moving around and other ways that you could interact that wouldn't be possible in the real world. This makes it more appealing to me to be able to play because it gives you an excuse to play a video game version as opposed to a physical table. One of those characters that will be moving around and making some brief appearances is the band mascot Alistair Fiend. But again, other than that, there's not really much to tie it to the band Motley Crue. The controls in Crue Ball are a bit different than the games previously mentioned on this list, as you're going to use left on the D-pad for the left flipper and the C button for the right flipper. If you press A, B, and C all together at the same time, that's how you nudge, and try not to do it too much because you don't want to tilt. There's also some elements where you can move the flippers up and down with up and down on the D-pad, because you're moved to a different screen and you need those flippers available to be able to hit the ball. And finally, for the last game, I definitely cheated a lot to be able to pick this one, as it's not really a random game and it is a favorite of mine. It's one you've definitely heard of and you've probably played, and that would be Sonic Spinball on the Sega Genesis. Released on November 23rd, 1993, it was developed by Sega Technical Institute, which was also known as STI, but I'm definitely not going to call it that for various reasons. Sega Technical Institute was founded in 1990 by Atari veteran and future Sony hardware designer Mark Cerny, because he wanted to develop games in America after working on Master System games in Japan. Starting off by making games for Genesis, Dick Tracy, and Kid Chameleon, it was after working on Sonic 2 that there was so much friction between the US and Japanese divisions of the studio that they officially split between the two. The American division made Sonic Spinball, while the Japanese side was busy making Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. When they realized that Sonic 3 wasn't going to be ready in time for the 1993 holiday season, they quickly fast-tracked making another game on the American side of things, and they were tasked with making a game with only 2 months to develop it. Sonic Spinball was born of all this chaos, and it has a simple-ish concept where you basically have Dr. Robotnik, which we now know worldwide as Eggman, and he's capturing people and putting them into giant pinball machines. It's up to Sonic to get inside this machine and save them. It plays very similar to other pinball games, but you can directly control Sonic. There are some platforming elements, and while he is spinning around as a ball, you can still somewhat direct him by using the D-pad left and right. The A button is your left flipper, the B button is your right flipper, and C is to do both at the same time. You're going to hit Sonic as the ball through these levels and flip switches and bash things around to be able to get the Chaos Emeralds. Once you gather all the Chaos Emeralds, you will then face a boss. As you would expect, once you beat the boss, you move on to the next level, and there are 4 levels to complete. Much like Crue Ball, playing Sonic Spinball is an experience that you cannot replicate playing it on a real physical pinball machine, and that made it a lot more fun for me to play. I still love playing actual real pinball, but if you can give me a reason to play something else, I'm gonna take it. They did later on release ports for the Game Gear and Sega Master System in 1994, but obviously being so late in the Master System's life cycle, it didn't sell very well. There's also all new theme music when playing Sonic Spinball because at the last minute they were told that they didn't actually have the rights to the original theme. This is because the pop band that created the music on Sonic 1 and 2 had blown up in popularity, and the amount of money that they wanted was something that Sega wasn't willing to pay. Sonic Spinball has been re-released so many times on various Sega game collections that I'm sure you have one somewhere, maybe collecting some dust in a closet somewhere. But if you don't have it already and you're looking for something a bit more current, you can get it on Steam, a more recent Xbox One and PS4 Genesis collection, and Nintendo Switch Online. It's very easy to pick up and play right now, so I do highly recommend it. And if you're looking for some extra Sonic Pinball action, there was a game called Sonic Pinball Party released on the Game Boy Advance in 2003. It's not one that I've played or anything, but I just figured I'd mention it, and maybe we'll see it on a future video on this channel. And with that being said, thanks for watching this list. How many of these games had you heard of before? Which ones were your favorite? What are some pinball games that you recommend that I check out in the future? Also, again, you can support us by going over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames and helping support us there. And until next time, thanks for watching.